Hi, I'm Victoria Peat, and in this video I'm going to show you a great technique for adding simple binding to a cute project like this mug rug. So I'm going to show you how to do a nice simple machine binding for a small project such as a mug rug or a mini quilt hanging or something like that. Something where the project is a little bit smaller and it's a little bit more difficult to try and get that invisible seam that we sometimes use on larger projects like quilts. So I've got a small project. This is my mug rug, and I've used this method on this one, and I'll show you on this other one that I'm partway through making. So I've got my quilt sandwich and I've done the quilting that I'd like to do, and I am ready to attach my binding. The binding that I'm using is 2¼ inches wide, and I folded that in half and pressed it, and I have also pressed under a small hem on one edge. So to attach that in place, I'm going to take my project and I'm going to place it with the edge that I'm starting my sewing on, running perpendicular, running away from me here. And I'm going to take my binding that's been folded in half, wrong sides together, and I'm going to start part way along this edge. I'm not going to go too close to this corner. You choose any edge you like. I'm just starting on the lower edge, and I'm placing the raw edges of the binding matching with the raw edges of the project. And I've got that little hem that's been folded under at one edge. And I'm going to take some sewing clips and I'm just going to clip in a couple of places just to hold that steady. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sew with 1/4 inch this section of the binding to my work. But I'm not going to start at this top edge. I'm going to leave this open, so for about 1 inch, 1.5 inches, and I'm going to sew all the way along here, and then when I get to 1/4 inch from this horizontal side, I'm going to stop, and then I'm going to sew in a 45-degree angle. So to mark that on my work, I'm going to take my quilting ruler. I'm going to place 1/4 inch line against the outside edge of my work, and I'm going to take a pin and pop that in perpendicular just through my work. So you can see that sticking out on the underside. So that's going to be a visual clue for me. So I'm going to start part way along, stitch down until my needle is meeting with this point here. So at my machine, I've got my 1/4 inch foot set up, and I've got my needle in the correct position for 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm starting about 1 inch to 1.5 inches from this folded edge. So I'm just going to start stitching. I remove the sewing clips as I go, and I'm just making sure that the raw edge of the binding is matching up with the raw edge of my work. And as I get a little bit closer to this pin, I've got a guide on the side of my foot, and what I don't want really is for this pin to go underneath. I'm just using it as a visual clue or a visual cue as to where I need to stop. So I'm just going to lift the presser foot and remove that pin, and I'm just going to eyeball where that 1/4 inch from this edge is. When I get to that point, I'm going to stop with my needle in the down position, lift my presser foot, turn my work so that I'm now going to sew diagonally from where my needle is dropping through to the very corner of my work. So I've then sewn at a 45-degree angle to where I was stitching. You see that here? So I've sewn straight, and I've got 1/4 inch from this raw edge, and I've pivoted and gone at a 45-degree angle. I'm then going to turn my work round, and if you can work on a cutting mat or something like a pressing mat here with the straight lines, it's always a help. You take your big long tail of binding and fold it up. So you want this raw edge to line in line with the next line of your work, and then you can finger press a line here, and then you're folding back on yourself. So take your tail and pull that back towards you, and then you're going to create a fold, and that fold you want to be in line with that top edge. And that's creating underneath here a nice fold, and that folded edge goes across the top of your work. And you can use your sewing clips, or if you prefer, you can put in a pin, whatever works for you. I don't tend to then pin or stitch, I don't pin or clip all the way down because I find it easier just to keep everything aligned as I go. So next place, I'm going to, for the next corner, I'm going to mark in with my pin 1/4 of an inch from that edge, just to remind me that I would like to pivot. Back across at my machine, lining up these raw edges, and I'm going to slide this in underneath the machine. I'm just going to start at this edge and I'm going to stitch all the way along, making sure these raw edges are matching nicely. And then I'm coming up to this corner. I'm going to remove my pin, go up to that point where I was 1/4 of an inch from the end, needle in the down position, lift my presser foot, rotate, so I know that I'm just going through this very corner of my project. Okay, so again, I've gone 1/4 of an inch all the way down, 1/4 of an inch from this end point. I've stopped and pivoted and come out at this angle. And then I'm going to repeat the same thing. So I've got the straight edge along a line on my cutting or pressing mat, fold my binding up. So it follows that nice straight line, finger press, bring the tail back down and make sure that fold across here horizontally runs in line with the other edge where you've just come down. So again, you can pin, you can use your clips or you can pin, whatever you're most comfortable with. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to stitch from here all the way down. And when we get to this corner here, we're going to stop 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Underneath the presser foot. Remembering not to sew over your pins. Aligning the raw edges. As and when you need to, just make sure that it's all nice and on top of each other. Remember to remove that pin. So 1/4 of an inch from the end, pivot, and then go through the corner of your work. Okay, so we've gone from this edge all the way along the length, 1/4 of an inch from this edge, and then gone out at an angle. So reposition your work. You've got a straight edge on a line on your cutting or pressing mat. Lift your tail up and away. Finger press this little 45-degree line. Fold back on yourself and get that fold running along, matching the raw edge on the previous edge that you've just sewn. And again, sewing clip or pin, whatever you prefer. I'm going to mark this 1/4 of an inch. Now you might be happy to do that by eye, but if not, then it's a good representation or visual guide for you. All the way along. Just lift your presser foot as and when necessary to make sure everything's smooth. And then I'm just going to remove that pin, pivot, and sew to the corner. Okay, one last time we're going to go up, finger press, and then back down. And I'm just going to hold that in place, sewing clip or a pin. And now, because we're coming back to where we started, we've got our little edge here where we've folded in a 1/4 of an inch hem. We want these two edges to overlap slightly, because what we're going to do is tuck this inside here, just to hide these ends. So you want that overlap not to be too much, you don't want it to be too long, and to be honest, you can't go too far because of where we've started stitching. So I'm just going to trim off some of that excess. And you can do that either with your scissors or you can do it on a cutting mat. I'm just going to open this out, slide this in, tuck that in nicely in there. Okay, and we'll do the same thing. We'll start off here, we'll work all the way down, we'll go over this hump here between the two layers of the binding and come back up to where we started and just overlap the stitches just a little bit. Again, just make sure your raw edges are matching. And I'm just allowing the binding to just tuck in underneath. And when you get to this point, just make sure that these go underneath the lip of the presser foot. If needs be, stop with your needle in the down position, lift your presser foot, and just slide that in. And I'm just making sure that this edge here is looking nice on this edge. And I'm just going to overlap that stitching. And if you prefer, you can do a little back stitch. And release your threads. So there is the binding attached all the way around the outside. At this point, I like to flip everything open here and going to give everything a press. So make sure that your iron is on and very carefully just press the binding away from your work or away from the front. And just try and get the iron into these little corners. I'm using a prim iron, a little one, but you can get travel irons or something small is useful to try and get in, because then with a large iron you're running the risk of not crushing but ironing this part of your work at the same time. So a little iron is really useful. So once you've ironed that all the way around, it's looking good. then what you can do is just flip everything over at the corners, and that allows you to bring everything round to the back of your work. Now you've got a couple different options here. Oh, let me just get rid of those threads. And you flip it over to this side. You can hand stitch this in place, but I don't know about you, but I'm always in a bit of a hurry, so I like to machine stitch. So to machine stitch, the way that I do that is I fold over, and then from the right side, I'll take my pins. These are my glass-headed quilter's pins. They're nice and long, and they're lovely and strong. And I'm folding the binding just so that it folds nice and tight over the top without bending or crushing the work underneath. And it goes round to the other side, and it goes just far enough to cover the line of stitching. And you can see here how I've pinned in the ditch between my work and the binding, but on the reverse, it's just catching like a 1/16 of an inch from the edge. So I'll fold over, and I'll do that all the way along. And I will pin these with the glass head. As I'm looking at my work, my glass head is to the right hand side and the sharp end of the pin is to the left, so that when I'm sewing through my machine, it makes them easy to remove. And every time I'm popping them in, I'm just checking to see whether on the underside it's even, so that I'm folding over a similar amount onto the reverse. Okay. And I tend to work along the sides and come back and do the corners afterwards. You can kind of feel with your fingers whether you're kind of in the right place. I'm stitching in that ditch and flipping over. I'm just doing a little tighter over. So I'm in the ditch and just checking on that side, it's looking good. The additional length on these pins makes this job so much easier. There we go. I'm just sticking those in. Oh, this other side as well. Okay, so now once I've done all of those, I'll then come back in and try and sort out these corners. So I'll make sure that the corner of the work, let's trim off that. So the corner of the work, in this case a mug rug, I'm making sure that that's still staying at a nice right angle. I'm just poking that underneath, making sure that's sitting flat. And I'll fold in the one side and then turn the other one over. So I'm trying to create a nice mitered right angle. With the work. And then I'll take a pin and I'm going to go through and back out. Okay, so I'll bring that up for you to see. So I've got the glass head on this outside rather than against my work, and I'm going through the layers. So once I've got this corner nice and in the right place, I'm sticking that pin through to hold that fold in place. And then I can move around to the next one, poke that corner in and over. So I've gone, this is nice and flat. The mug rug is flat. I've poked the corner in, turn over with the binding as far as I can, and then folding it back from the other side. And I'm looking for a nice 45-degree angle. And when I'm happy, between thumb and forefinger, put my pin in and out through that corner to hold that in place. Okay, and just double, making sure that it looks nice from the other side. Pushing across and over. What you don't want to do is be too tight on the corner so that you end up with a round corner, because it can be very easy to pull too tight. And sometimes it needs more than one go at folding. And you might be happy just using a sewing clip, but I find by sticking your pin through you get a better result, and it's just a little bit more secure. Let's get rid of these threads. It's another loose thread there. Let me deal with that in a second. So I'm folding down. Trying to get the pin through without poking my finger. Last thing we need. There we go. I'll just deal with that one. I just want to take those threads out. Now, if you're hand stitching, you can obviously do these corners as you go, but with machine stitching, it's easier if you can just get those folded before you start. So now that I've got all of these 4 corners done, I then want to go and machine stitch these. My personal preference is to machine stitch in the ditch, which leaves a little hem, little line of stitching just on the binding on the other side. So if I show you on this one, I've done a stitch in the ditch all the way around the outside, and on the reverse you can see a line of stitching that goes round on the binding. It's totally personal preference how you'd like to do that, but that's the method I like to use. So at the sewing machine, I have myself set up with a stitch in the ditch foot, or you could use an edge stitch foot and just get the settings right on your machine to get the needle drop in the right position. But I'll be using this little guide in the middle to run along the ditch of between my binding and my work. So I'll drop that down. And this guide will just help me to sew in that ditch. Now I've got these pins going diagonally through, so just bear that in mind when you're coming near to this corner. Just go nice and carefully and don't go through that pin. But you'll find that when you get to this corner, you can remove this pin because the weight of the machine will hold down that fold for you. Just go nicely into that corner, stopping with the needle in the down position and pivoting round. Just make sure that you remove each of those pins as you get to them. Watch this one in the corner. And stitch as far as you can up to the binding. and pivot round. Allow the guide to just travel along the ditch. Oh, it's a little bit bulkier there, over the join. You may find you want to just adjust your needle drop position a little bit to the left or the right, depending on the setup with your machine and how it works with that foot. Just removing that pin. Right to the corner, needle in the down position, pivot. Removing that pin before I get to it. Slowly working my way up to the corner. I think I've got room for one more stitch. Taking those pins out, and then I'm going to come back to where I started and maybe just do one stitch or two beyond. Lift my needle and pull my work out. Then you can take your threads and you can pull those through to the wrong side. So I'll just pull the bobbin thread so that I've got a little loop coming through. And I'll pull those both to the wrong side. If you can't pull that loop through for any reason, you can just thread it through using a needle and thread. And I'm going to tie those off. This one's a little bit more challenging because I didn't leave a long tail on that thread when I started. I just started from my bobbin. So that one probably needs a little bit more attention, which I will do later. But I would then take a self-threading needle and bury those threads, or tie them, snip them off. It's up to you. And then give everything a bit of a press. Use a pressing cloth if desired, just to tidy up your work. Oh. And there you go. There is your binding attached. And I've done mine on my mug rug. And it's a really lovely, simple method, and I hope you find it useful.